Thank you for that. It's a challenge for me. In these kind of forums, I've always been an opening batsman and laying down the gauntlet of, come on guys, let's go do something. I'm not sure that's what this group wants to hear at that point. So this speech was actually written between about the hours of about 2:30 this morning and about 3 a.m. as I decided to junk everything I was going to talk about. So, Stephen made a comment that the only people who aren't criticised are the ones who aren't doing anything. So we occasionally need to put ourselves out there. So bear with me as I do that. It's only 12 months ago that the global financial crisis started. And you might recall that it's only 12 months ago, about 12 months, in fact, a few weeks, the Lehman Brothers collapsed, which was pivotal, I should say. So why was Lehman Brothers so important? And it was a tipping point, and quite often what we find with very significant change is there is a tipping point involved. Lehman Brothers was that tipping point, not because of its scale, but because it was allowed to fail. And so that had ramifications on the entire system in which we all operate. The capital markets around the world froze and a range of things happened. And of course you'll remember the inquiries that happened and the congressional inquiries where a number of people were summoned to explain what they'd done and basically explain their behaviour. So we had a situation there where the chairman and CEO of Lehman Brothers was in a difficult situation, and you can see the body language associated with that. Of course, there was contagion that then happened because it's a whole system. So it wasn't very long before it moved from Wall Street to Main Street. And you recall these kind of images. That's the American motor industry. Now, I can't remember if that's the photo when they flew down on the Learjets independently or the ones where they carpooled. But you remember kind of the reflection and the sentiment of the community at the time was, well, the motoring industry, pillars of our community, fundamentally important to the identity of America. And these guys are all potentially going to go bankrupt. They don't seem to be in tune with what's going on. And I guess the message and feedback was, look, it doesn't send a really good message when you fly here in your private jets asking for more money. It doesn't seem you're really in tune with the average Joe taxpayer who now needs to pay for this. Behaviour of leaders and some of the things we learnt from that, I think it's important to think, and I really do feel sorry for the circumstance that Alan Greenspan was in. He was called in and I remember a look of worry on his face at the time to say, look, you understand this better than anyone, what happened? What happened here? And his testimony was, I'm not really sure. I had 40 years of history to say that we were doing things really well. And there was a period of deep reflection for him. The thing that I'm really upset about is that, one of the things that I'm upset about is I'm a West Australian by birth, and everyone's blaming my national and state emblem, which is the black swan. Sorry, Larry's laughing because he knows some of the language behind this, but the black swan internationally has become known as kind of a metaphor or an image for the unexpected event that changes everything. And people are blaming this. And what people are saying is, look, some things are unexpected, we can't reasonably foresee those, and we don't have those capabilities. I was lucky enough to hear Al Gore when he was in town last, and he made this statement. We have a habit of confusing the unprecedented with the unlikely. And I think one of the failures about risk management and risk management approaches, and humans in general, because risk management is just a discipline to help us think and help us manage, is that we have a real habit of dealing in the known and the recent experience. So if it's been precedented, we're pretty good at foreseeing it. We've dealt with that before, we've experienced it in our lives. If we haven't experienced things before, then we don't see them. And I think that's something that we need to acknowledge. I'll take you through how that manifests itself shortly. Of course, outrage. We live in a different world today. There used to be a time when shares were held by fairly affluent members of society, and it was an element of their risk capital. Of course, today that risk and responsibility has been transferred to the average Joe in the street through pension funds and superannuation. the vast majority of the way that markets work these days are the superannuation funds and investments of the average person in the street. And of course, there's outrage associated with that. So superannuation funds are now the norm. They control something like 80% of the capital in the Australian listed market. It's a different world today. And with that comes responsibility at a community level, which becomes incredibly difficult for policymakers, and we'll come to that shortly. Part of the outrage is people on the outside trying to understand what happens in boardrooms and what happens in management teams and what are people thinking. Do we do the right thing and manage risks because they're the right thing to do? So irrespective of consequences, they're the right things to do, you just do them. And Stephen was kind enough to share some examples of great leadership like that. Do we only do things when the fiduciary responsibilities are spelt out in common law or in other ways, through regulation or statute or otherwise, that actually set out what our responsibilities are, and is that the point where we kick in? Do we actually need that lever? Even more cynical, and this is a more populist view and gaining currency by the day, and you would have seen the Productivities Commission's report in the last 48 hours about executive remuneration. Do people only act when there's legal requirements that pin down to a personal level? And does that skew behaviour? One of the behaviours I observe in boardrooms is that there is a strong focus on occupational health and safety, which is a wonderful thing and appropriate, but quite often the focus is on, well, that crystallises down to me as a personal liability, let's deal with that. And so I don't believe that's the underlying motivation, but there can be a perception that perhaps there is an element of that in human behaviour. In Australia, we've been talking about leadership here today. I believe we're in the middle of a crisis in leadership. We've experienced the largest turnover in Australian chief executives in history. I'll just let that keep going. That's not a full list. There's been some since I did the slides, and I ran out of room, unfortunately. This is the largest period of turnover of CEOs in history. This is not normal generational turnover. So what we have a situation there is the average man in the street will say, well, look, some people left with a lot of cash and then we got left holding some pretty unfortunate circumstances. Did they do a run-up? Did they foresee this and leave with some of our cash? And people have perceptions around the ethics around that. There are others, they're saying, how could they not foresee these circumstances and therefore were they competent to do the job? And you'll see a number of pillars of society have been tarnished with that brush. I was having a chat with Stephen Mayne. You may know him, that he's the shareholder activist that's quite famous for that and started Crikey. And we were talking about the fact that directors were being brought to account, and he's very active in that. The observation I made to Stephen was, look, we need to be careful with that because if we actually tarnish all the directors, there may be no directors left and a very inexperienced leadership at the helm. So we need to actually understand the ramifications of those. So I see that as a crisis in leadership. And potentially people are connected to us in this room.